You'll have to forgive me. I ask your indulgence. As I get older, I find that my memory is failing more and more, so I wrote down my speech. And
It's like the healthcare bill.
okay. What prompted kind of this discussion was our speaker last month, or the last meeting, from the Vaughn family. And the story of Aaron and the other Navy SEALs and what they're going through in Afghanistan, the troops who are still left there, is an untold story that's being hidden from all of us by the military, by this administration, and by the Obama media, who covers for him on every issue. It's been a subject of great concern to me. I've raised it with some of the flag officers that I know. But nobody really wants to deal with that issue. There are a few people on Fox News who will go on there and talk about some of these things that have gone on. But as a former JAG out at Hurlburt Field, one of my jobs when I first got there was the dubious distinction of going out to especially the flying units, and doing their annual training in the law of armed conflict. How many of you have ever sat through one of those sessions? Brian and a few others. How many are military, have any military experience in the room? Okay, for those of you, I'm kind of preaching to the choir, because you've heard some of these things before, but that was back during the Vietnam era. And, we talked about certain things, like if you parachute and you hit the ground and you try to start firing at somebody, they'll shoot you back. They're not going to be nice to you. You have to throw up your hands and surrender, and then you wind up being treated like our good friend George Day. And that was about the time when I was really hoping for chicken wire in front of the podium, so that when they started throwing the beer bottles at Commander's Call, it was like the Blues Brothers movie when they went into the country music, the country bar up in Chicago. And I said, look, guys, you don't have to agree with this. You just have to sit here and listen to the lecture, because we have to check it off on your training schedule. So that's where my exposure to this started. But right now we have a situation here, what I call the corrosion of the military justice system in the U.S. military. Now, we're all concerned about things that are adversely affecting the military, the attack on Christians, for example. We have seen the long-term struggle ever since the problem with HIV first surfaced, of the desire to get people into the military who were gay, so that the motivation was, hey, the VA provides, at that time, lifetime medical care for retired people. That was very expensive. We'll get them to be in the military, and you get your dependent spouse to be covered. That was another attack on the military and the benefits. This is one of the things that's happening now with the rules of engagement that we see, the compliance with the laws of armed conflict that we see, that is being turned around against our troops. It's never enforced against the enemies that we ask them to fight. And in fact, now we tell them, don't fight with the people who are out to kill you. And that is my real concern. Now, we could go back to ancient history. The Bible even has references about certain treatments of how to treat people in the event of a conflict. So there's always been a discussion down through the centuries of proper treatment of people who are engaged in the conflict, things that you could or could not do. It was certain behaviors were acceptable, others were not. But not until the mid 19th century did we ever get into the discussion of formal treaties or things written down, rules written by someone as to how the troops were to behave. One of the earliest ones was during the Civil War, the Lieber Code for Union troops. Now, you know that the treatment of prisoners wasn't very good. You can go up to a place not far from here, just a 3-hour drive in Georgia, and see the grave sites of the thousands of Union prisoners who died in that camp. But now, and in World War subsequent to that, after a battle in Europe, because there was constant fighting in the Napoleonic era and later in Europe between the Prussians and the French and the Russians and the Austrians, there was a lot of killing. So they decided, well, wait a minute, we need to come up with some way to avoid the needless deaths, because most of the deaths, people were not killed outright. They lay there wounded, and there was no one to go out there and help them. That was one of the first rules that they came up with. And that was in the mid-1800s. And then during and after World War I, there were several conventions, formal conventions, where they started writing down these rules and about the treatment. A lot of it was prompted by the German submarines attacking merchant ships and other things. And they said, well, what are we going to do? What's the responsibility to take care of those people whose ship has been torpedoed and they're now in a lifeboat out in the middle of the ocean? Is there any responsibility to go out there and reach out to them and or just let them die? So they started, well, okay, we got to do something about that. So what did we get? We got diplomats and lawyers to sit down, and you know I'm a former member of the Florida Bar, and I emphasize former member of the Florida Bar. I'm in the 12-step program for recovering attorneys. So it's usually the people who write the rules are not the ones who are out there on the front lines dealing with those situations. And we see that today to the nth degree. We have predators. We have these drones of every shape and size that fly over the battlefield, that videotape what is going on, and we have a lawyer sitting back next to the commander's desk. Oh, wait a minute, sir. I know you've got an F-18 orbiting over this Marine unit that's down here in Helmand Province, but you're kind of there. The enemy position is kind of close to the village, and it's at nighttime. We don't want to wake them up because Mr. Karzai will get upset. And that's literally what the kids are dealing with. I have one of my Eagle Scouts is an former F-18 pilot. He's now stationed over at Pensacola. And I asked him, I said, you're a Navy pilot. Why in Sam Hill have you agreed, you just got back from the deployment on the Nimitz, why do you want to go to the Navy school to become a naval gunfire officer and forward air controller with the Marine Corps on the ground in Afghanistan? Are you crazy? And, you know, I had reason to ask him that because I've known this child for a long time. He's like my other son. And he said, I got so frustrated flying around in circles, listening to the kids on the ground, talking on the radio, asking for help. And by the time someone up the chain of command decided they were going to give us a chance to roll in on the target, we were out of fuel, had to go back, tank up. By the time we got back, the enemy had moved closer to the village, and no, we can't help them anymore. That's what we're dealing with. Now, where did all these things come from? We have 4 conventions called the Geneva Conventions. They date back to 1949. They dealt with mostly treatment of prisoners, treatment of non-combatants, civilians, what you're supposed to do in those cases. But if you have followed the discussion of Iraq or what's going on in Afghanistan since 2001, when shortly after the attack on the World Trade Centers, as Ricky knows very well, the troops went into Afghanistan, quickly displaced the Taliban. Everything was going fine. There were very few casualties during that period of time when President Bush was in office. And we followed the rules. The people had an election. They were happy. They had a chance to live free. Young girls were going to go to school. Judge Maney, my neighbor, was over there at the time helping out with the elections. We were even sending from this community clothing for children and young girls for the first time in their lives ever to go to school, to get an education. All that thing is changing now because the rules changed. We got a new president in there, and they decided, well, we don't want to do things that would disturb the villagers. Mostly it was President Karzai's objection to what the U.S. military was doing, because he was, when Obama announced that they were leaving as soon as he was the president, he quickly announced that we weren't going to be hanging around very long. He decided, I'm going to save my own neck and start having secret negotiations with the enemy that's fighting the American soldiers. And that's when things started to change. And we saw a dramatic increase in the casualty rates. You can look at the numbers by year from 2001 up to the present. And it was a dramatic shift from 2009 on. And it's all because of the rules of engagement. Who was responsible for that? General McChrystal. And now, do you remember, anybody want to tell me who he supported during the presidential campaign in 2008?
Commander-in-Chief.
We had the top commander in Afghanistan became a military advisor to a guy who knew nothing about the U.S. military.
It's got to be Obama. Exactly.
General McChrystal was the rationale was, well, we got to win the hearts and minds of the people. We don't want to offend them. Okay? Now, the Geneva Conventions and the way we teach our troops is that, yes, you must treat these people humanely. You have to, try to avoid collateral damage. Do we go around now? How many of you were old enough to remember World War II, or your father was in World War II? Raise your hands. Now, do you ever talk to your parents? Did you ever have an opportunity to talk about the raids on Dresden in Germany? Or the places where they actually dropped firebombs on the cities and the whole city burned down?
They dropped it on the civilians, too.
The whole city was gone.
Done in Afghanistan.
Okay? Now, that was perfectly acceptable. We even dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan.
Yeah.
Right? No criticism. And the Geneva Conventions of 1949 did not outlaw nuclear weapons. We still got them in the silos. Now, all the people who work in the silos are being fired by the Obama administration, by the way. But we still have those weapons. Will we ever use them? Probably not. Because this guy doesn't perceive anybody as an enemy worth fighting. But now in Afghanistan, and we saw it first in Iraq, that as soon as we announced that they were leaving, what did the guys do? Well, we tell them what our rules of engagement are. We tell them what they're saying. That we say, well, and I wrote a set of rules of engagement when I first heard about this. And I was just being a smart ass that I tend to be. And so I came up with a set of rules of engagement and I put them on the website. And I tried to be as ridiculous as possible. One of which was, you may not, if you see an enemy carrying a weapon and he's pointing it at you, you may not fire in his direction until he fires first. And that if you are lucky enough not to be hit right between the eyes by that round, you may fire back in their general direction, but for God's sakes, don't break anything or hurt anybody. Now, if you are unfortunate enough to be hit by that first round that the enemy fires, don't worry about it, because we're going to name a nice building after you at your home base. After the, we give the gratuity payment to your family, and then we have the nice ceremony with the flag. But that was, my facetious comment about the rules of engagement. Well, when I found out what they actually were, sometime later on, later in 2009, holy cow, this stuff is more ridiculous than the facetious comments that I made. Because they literally, now we own the night, right? We've got the surveillance equipment. It's flying around on all kinds of remotely piloted vehicles. We have troops that have night vision goggles. We have the weaponry to deal with all kinds of situations. But the troops are not allowed to utilize that to their advantage because it's unfair. Well, wait a minute now. We're taking advantage of that because we're a technological society and we've got all this fancy equipment, and we could go in there and we could see the people sneaking around from place to place. And you could go on YouTube and you can find examples where there was a truck that broke down in the road. And so the guy gets out there, and it's an infrared camera taken from a helicopter, and he gets out, they're taking the weapons out, and they're going to the side of the road, and they're burying them along the side of the road. They're caching those weapons. And you can see that. And they're told, well, wait a minute, you can't do that. There have been people prosecuted for shooting an individual dressed as a woman, and they could see the point of the RPG sticking up under her head covering. You can't shoot at them. The weapon has to be in plain sight. Now, that is not in the Geneva Conventions. And in fact, in the in the conventions themselves, they have a classification called an unlawful combatant. Have any of you heard Obama ever use that term, or anybody in the media ever use that term, except maybe for General McInerney on Fox News? Can you tell me what an unlawful combatant is? Anybody?
Wearing civilian clothes.
Person who is engaging, say, a lawful combatant is a person who is a member of a uniformed service, wearing the uniform, engaging in combat for a country, a recognized party to the conflict,
and abides by the Geneva Convention.
that complies with the rules. All right? Now, members of militias can also be covered if they wear some distinctive outfit, they carry the weapon openly, and they also abide by the rules. Now, people who will get their daughters or sons to strap a vest to themselves and send them into a marketplace to blow up even people of their own religion in their own community, but they may be a different sect of that religion. Do they comply with any of these rules? No. And if you don't, you're technically not covered. You're not entitled to treatment as prisoners of war, as a prisoner of war, if you were subsequently captured. But guess what? In this country, We don't draw that distinction anymore. That's why you never hear a discussion of what is an unlawful or somebody being labeled an unlawful combatant. And that's what drives me nuts. Because we have lawyers who have preferred to treat these people, well, we captured them. Yes, the Al-Qaeda people, they did these dastardly things, and they'll chop people's heads off or hands off or do any of these things that are all violations of the law of armed conflict. And any of those individual actions, you lose the status. But we're going to be magnanimous because we're the United States, and they consider us the great Satan. And we don't want them to not like us because President Obama went out on this big apology tour to every Muslim country in the Middle East and said, we promise to be nice, and if we stop doing all these things that you don't like, will you be our friend? So literally, because President Karzai is having secret meetings with the Taliban, early in his reign as president, in his service as the president, the troops were told, you will no longer use mortars at night because it disturbs the sleep of the villagers. So even though the enemy troops, are moving from place to place at night, well, you don't want to make any noise because we don't want to disturb the village elders while they're sleeping because they're going to make a call to President Karzai, and we want them to be our friends. So our troops are on the line. We don't even, and as Mr. Vaughn so poignantly stated, we are not even allowed to check out the backgrounds of the people that learn of the intelligence and our upcoming operations because, well, they might be offended. Well, don't you trust us? And this is what the kids are. Is there any wonder now that they come back and we've seen such a rise in PTSDs? They've had videotape of guys being out there, hiding in the rocks, running out onto a road that's frequently used by convoys, and at night, when the drone is overhead, or a helicopter equipped with infrared cameras is flying in that area, they see the guy dig a hole in the ground, put something in it, cover it up, and go back and wait in the rocks, and then pick up a weapon. Oh, well, you're not allowed to shoot him because he didn't have the rifle, in his hands. It was over there 50 feet away. And if you do shoot him, you're going to get prosecuted. And that was the case of the Lawrence case that we interviewed the family. I don't know how, show of hands, anybody hear that interview? The Lawrence, Lieutenant Lawrence is a young man. His mom was an assistant U.S. attorney. Father was an investigator for the state of Oklahoma, right, Andy? I think it was Oklahoma. He is now at Fort Leavenworth because he was appointed on short notice as a leader of a platoon in Afghanistan, where only 2 days before the previous platoon leader was killed. When several Afghans came roaring up on motorbikes, threw hand grenades at them, and the leader was killed. They were just supposed to be following an Afghan patrol. They were training them. You're not allowed to fire your weapons. Do not use your guns. You let the Afghans do it. They're in charge now. You're just there as an observer. 2 days later, when the same scenario repeated itself, this young lieutenant says, I'm not going to get my people killed. He ordered one of the guys with a sniper rifle, take out those people on the motorbike, which they did. He was charged with murder. Okay? The Lieutenant Bahena case. Another example where he was ordered by the intelligence officers back at the base. They had a known terrorist who had been involved in acts of terror. They told him, okay, we've got nothing really to hold him right now. Take him back to the village. How are we doing on time, Brenda? take him back to the village. Well, the lieutenant on the way back decided he was going to stop and get some more intelligence information, sat the guy down on a pile of rocks, and at some point in that time frame, along with the interpreter was there, the gentleman made the terrorist, the guy who's being interrogated, grab for his gun, and the gun went off and he was killed. They charged Lieutenant Behenna with murder, shooting this terrorist. The one thing that the media never mentioned was that this individual, unfortunately, just a few days later, a report came down from higher headquarters that this guy who had been killed had been put on the shoot-to-kill list. But it was too late to help the lieutenant because they claimed he murdered the guy before the list was approved. All right? The worst thing about it was, and this is what I'm talking about, the corruption in the military justice system. The lawyers in that case, the trial counsel who were brought in, brought a forensic expert from the United States. They brought him to the trial, did not use him. Do you know why? Because after their expert looked at the evidence, photos, things like that, the evidence of the body, and he was trying to figure out the angle that the bullet made in his, and as the lieutenant was testifying in his own defense as to what happened, he leaned over and he told the trial counsel, what this kid has said is totally consistent with my conclusions based on the forensic evidence. That the guy had to have, because of where the bullet struck his body, there were 2 rounds that hit him, where those bullets struck his body, it had to have happened exactly the way the defendant has said. They did not call him as a witness because that would have hurt their case. And violating federal law, which is a requirement, exculpatory evidence, something that would show that maybe the defendant was in fact telling the truth and wasn't guilty of the crime which he has been charged, their obligation was to tell the trial counsel during the course of the trial. They told them later after the verdict. The court-martial panel found him guilty. The judge did not allow the lieutenant to present evidence in his own defense regarding some of what happened. He was found guilty. He was originally sentenced to 25 years in prison. And I think the court, on appeal, went all the way up to the level where the only step that beyond the court in the military justice system would have been an appeal, further appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States, which refused to grant cert to hear that case. But the lower court appeals courts acknowledged the violation of the federal law by the trial counsel in denying this gentleman the opportunity to present that evidence to the court that convicted him, and they said, well, it doesn't make any difference because he shouldn't have been talking to the guy in the first place. All right? Now, the commander, who was forced by higher-ups to bring that court-martial action against him, the higher-level commander reduced the sentence by 5 years. Okay? Which to the maximum that he could do. But we have 10 people like that sitting in Fort Leavenworth where the military justice system, and that's just the Army. We haven't talked about the Haditha case in the Marine Corps in Iraq, if you remember that famous case, where the Navy CID interrogators came in. Now, this was a situation where the guy who wound up being charged and court-martialed was the lieutenant colonel, the commander of the unit involved. He wasn't even there. He was back at the base. But they didn't have enough evidence to charge the kids who were on the patrol, where they said that they went into a house and shot up the people. And at that time, the guy who brought that action, who claimed that this all happened, was a known to the claims officers, the JAGs who paid claims for, oh, sorry about that, we blew up your car. We'll write you a check for a new car. It's our, excuse me. We have claims officer over there even now. That's one of the things that judge advocates do in the field. The claims officers had paid this guy numerous times, claiming that, stuff was broken. They knew it was fake. But he brought in this evidence and filed this claim, and that these Marines did this stuff and these people were killed. They would bring bodies from the hospital, dead bodies from the hospital, and put them in the house, and then he would take the videotapes and say these people were shot up by the U.S. military, and then file a claim on the behalf of the family. All right? They knew that about this gentleman. The commander, and at the higher level, as the action was going on, they were listening on the radio. Not only the lieutenant colonel, but people above him, even back in Washington, D.C., they were listening to the firefight going on. They tried to charge the enlisted troops. And what are you going to do with a young enlisted guy who's a two-striper? And you got some investigator who comes in and says, look, pal, unless you give us a statement and you give us all the information and you say it the way we want you to say it, you're going down for this deal. We know we're not sure that you actually pulled the trigger, but you're going to get 20 years unless you tell us, Sergeant Smith did it. And that's what some of the guys rolled and said, okay, it wasn't me. Now, they weren't successful in prosecuting the enlisted people. Those charges were ultimately dropped for lack of evidence by a military judge, thank God, who was doing his job and wasn't taking orders from the higher-ups. But there was a JAG in the Marine Corps, a colonel, who was over there at the time, advised the commander to bring charges against them, and when the case was transferred back home and they all came back to California, where the trials actually took place, also acted as the legal advisor to the convening authority. Now, he'd been over there, and then he comes back to the home base, and he's not a disinterested party, telling the commander, here's my reasoned legal opinion about what should be done. He pushed that thing, and fortunately, that military judge, the only reason why now he lost his career and cost him thousands of dollars in debt to defend himself. And the Thomas More Law Center in Michigan did help him with that case. But it still cost him his career. The guy did nothing wrong. Nothing happened to the CID, the Navy criminal investigators. Nothing happened to the judge advocate who did that, but the military judge did find command influence, and he dropped the charges against the lieutenant colonel. This is the corruption that is happening in the military. We've got people over there second-guessing a 19-year-old kid. Now, I could read you some of the language of these things. A prisoner of war may only be transferred by the detaining power to a power which is a party to the convention, and after the detaining power has satisfied itself of the willingness and the ability of such transferring power to apply the convention when prisoners of war are transferred. 19-year-old kids are supposed to understand this stuff. in the heat of battle when somebody's firing a gun at them? And you wonder why they come back messed up in the head. Now, those of you who served during the Vietnam era, raise your hand. Did you have to deal with any of these things where you were told you cannot fire in self-defense?
We were told to fire in self-defense. We were told to do that.
Okay. In Somalia, I have, if I can find it real quick. Back in Somalia, remember when we went in there? Here was the rules of engagement that were given to the troops, printed out. Nothing in these rules of engagement limits your right to take appropriate action to defend yourself and your unit. And then it goes on to list, you have the right to use force to defend yourself against attacks or threats of attack. We weren't even involved in the fight like we were in Iraq or Afghanistan. We were in there. That was a humanitarian intervention, remember?
What year was that?
92. That was Operation Provide Relief. Hostile fire may be returned effectively and promptly to stop a hostile action. What are they telling the troops now? You are not allowed to fire. You let the Afghans you are with and following down, through the village on patrol, you let them deal with the situation.
So they can shoot you in the back of your head.
Okay? They don't even check the people coming onto the installation for weapons. That was the case of the young man who was shot by a 19-year-old. They knew the local police chief was Taliban. He had access to the base. He got this 19-year-old access to the base. The guy walks into the gym and kills 3 people. They knew it. They weren't allowed to say, keep this guy off the installation because we don't want to offend. It's political correctness that's driving this train. And where are the Judge Advocates General of the military services regarding this? Do you hear him speaking out? Do you hear him testifying before Congress that we've got to change the rules? We've got to be realistic. We've got to treat these people as true enemies because they don't follow the rules? No, we want to be nice guys, and nice guys mean our kids get killed. And we got 2.5 more years to put up with this. And I pray to the good Lord that we get someone as a commander-in-chief who will recognize that we owe it to the kids we asked to go out there and defend this country to cover their back. Because I was taught from the time I was 13 years old and first got into junior ROTC that loyalty goes up and down the chain of command. And we don't see it coming down there from the perfume princes in the Pentagon, and nor from the now head of Homeland Security, who was a lawyer in the Department of Defense working with the Hagel-Bagel, who's the Secretary of Defense, nor from the Commander-in-Chief in the White House. And that's all I've got to say, if you have any questions. Now, what you need to do, what I'm asking you to do, is contact your congressman and Senator Nelson and say, we're tired of these kids being thrown on the ash heap just because President Obama wants to placate a guy whose brother was a heroin trafficker. Thank you.
Questions?